In December of 1256, a Persian astronomer stood amid the ruin of a burning library and made a choice. His name was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. He was one of the greatest scientific minds of the 13th century, a mathematician, an astronomer, a philosopher whose work would shape Islamic science for generations. And on this particular night, in a mountain fortress in northern Persia, he was surrounded by fire. The library at Alamut was burning. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, theology, philosophy, poetry, were going up in smoke at the order of Hulagu Khan, the Mongol general who had just completed the conquest of the Nizari Ismaili state. Al-Tusi moved through the smoke and the ruin, selecting what he could carry. He could not carry everything. No one could have. What burned that night has never been recovered. What was saved exists today in fragments, scattered across libraries from Tehran to London to Cairo, and the full extent of what was lost. What ideas, what discoveries, what centuries of accumulated thought turned to ash in those hours remains one of the great unanswered questions in the history of human knowledge. This is not a story about a battle. It is not a story about conquest, though conquest is part of it. This is a story about what happens when knowledge is treated as a threat, when books are considered more dangerous than armies, when the deliberate destruction of a library is not an accident of war, but a decision. It is also a story about survival, because some of what was at Alamut did survive, and the path of that survival, what was saved, how it was saved, and who decided what was worth saving, tells us something uncomfortable about how civilization works, something that still matters today. To understand what was lost at Alamut, you have to understand what Alamut was. The fortress had been the intellectual and spiritual center of the Nizari Ismaili state for nearly 170 years by the time Hulagu's army arrived. From the moment Hasan-i established his community there in 1090, the Nizaris had been building something unusual in the medieval Islamic world. A state whose legitimacy rested not on military conquest or dynastic inheritance, but on the authority of religious knowledge. The Ismaili tradition had always placed extraordinary emphasis on learning. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, the great Ismaili state from which the Nizaris had broken away, had established Al-Azhar, one of the oldest universities in the world, as a center of Ismaili scholarship. When the Nizaris lost their connection to Cairo after the succession crisis of 1094, they did not abandon that tradition. They intensified it. Alamut became, in the words of the Persian historian Juwayni, who was himself present during the Mongol conquest, and thus one of our primary witnesses, a place of extraordinary intellectual activity. Juwayni was not a sympathetic observer. He was a Sunni administrator working for the Mongol government, and he had every reason to minimize the Nizari intellectual legacy. And yet even he acknowledged that the library at Alamut was something remarkable. What did the library contain? This is where the historical record becomes fragmentary. We know the library held works on astronomy and mathematics, because Al-Tusi's own accounts reference the instruments and texts he found there. We know it held works on philosophy, texts that engaged with Neoplatonism, with Aristotelian logic, with the great currents of Islamic philosophy that were transforming the intellectual world of the 12th and 13th centuries. We know it held theological and legal texts, the accumulated scholarship of nearly 2 centuries of an independent Ismaili state. We know it held historical chronicles, records of the Nizari community's own history, written from within, in contrast to the hostile external accounts that are almost all we have left. And we know it held scientific instruments alongside the books, astrolabes, globes, measuring devices of a sophistication that surprised even the Mongols. What we do not know is almost everything else. How many volumes were there? The estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Figures that should be treated with caution. What proportion survived? We cannot say. What was in the texts that burned? We will never know. The Nizari intellectual tradition was not simply a collection of books. It was a living system of thought, developed over generations by scholars who built on each other's work, who engaged with the great traditions of the Islamic world, and adapted them to their own theological framework. The Ismaili thinkers had developed a distinctive approach to the relationship between reason and revelation, a philosophical position that held that the surface meaning of Scripture concealed deeper truths, accessible only through rigorous intellectual effort. This tradition produced remarkable thinkers. Nasir Khusraw, the 11th century Ismaili poet and philosopher, wrote works that combined theological argument with literary brilliance in ways that are still studied today. The tradition of Ismaili Ta'wil, the practice of allegorical interpretation of religious texts, generated a substantial body of philosophical literature that was among the most sophisticated religious philosophy being produced anywhere in the medieval world. And almost all of it burned, not by accident, not as collateral damage. The burning of the Alamut library was a deliberate act. Juwayni, our most important eyewitness, describes the process with a clarity that leaves little room for ambiguity. The Nizari Imam Rukin al-Din Kursha surrendered at the fortress of Maymundiz in November 1256. Alamut Castle itself fell the following month, in December. The Mongol forces moved through the fortress. Juwayni himself was given access to the library. He describes choosing books on astronomy and mathematics, keeping those he considered valuable and setting aside the rest. The rest was burned. Juwayni's account also tells us what he chose not to save. He was interested in scientific and mathematical texts. He was not interested in Ismaili theology or philosophy. The texts that formed the core of the Nizari intellectual tradition, the works that represented the community's own understanding of itself and its faith, were, in his judgment, not worth preserving. They burned. This is not simply a story about Mongol destruction. It is a story about the politics of preservation. Every time a library burns, decisions are made, consciously or not, about what counts as knowledge worth keeping. At Alamut, those decisions were made by a Sunni administrator working for a pagan conqueror in the ruins of a Shia intellectual tradition he regarded as heretical. The survival of certain texts and the destruction of others was not random. It reflected a judgment about which knowledge was legitimate and which was not. Al-Tusi's own survival is one of the more complex episodes in this story. He had gone to the Nizari fortresses years before the Mongol conquest. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some sources suggest he was there voluntarily, attracted by the library and the intellectual atmosphere of the Nizari community. Others suggest he was brought there under some form of pressure. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and we may never have a definitive answer. What is clear is that when the Mongols arrived, Al-Tusi chose to work with them. He descended from Maymundiz alongside Rukin al-Din Kursha on the day of surrender. He became one of Hulagu Khan's most valued advisors, accompanying the army as it moved west. He was present at the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the catastrophic Mongol sack that ended the Abbasid Caliphate and destroyed another great library, the House of Wisdom. And he eventually persuaded Hulagu to build him an observatory at Maragheh in northwestern Persia, where he assembled the most advanced astronomical research facility of the medieval Islamic world. The instruments from Alamut went to Maragheh. Some of the manuscripts did too. Al-Tusi used them, built on them, incorporated their knowledge into his own work. His Ziji Ilkhani, a set of astronomical tables compiled at Maragheh, drew on observations and calculations that had been developed at Alamut. His work on trigonometry, which would eventually influence the development of mathematics in Europe, built on intellectual foundations that had been laid in part by the Nizari scholarly tradition. This is the paradox at the heart of this story. Al-Tusi, who collaborated with the people who burned the library, also ensured that some of its knowledge survived. The survival was partial, selective, filtered through his own judgment. But it was survival. Without him, less would remain. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, destroyed 2 years after Alamut, presents a different and even more devastating example. The Abbasid library had been accumulating knowledge for nearly 5 centuries. It held translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts, works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, carried into Arabic by generations of scholars. It held original Islamic scientific work, advances in algebra, in optics, in medicine, in astronomy that had no equivalent in the medieval European world. The Mongols destroyed it in 1258 with a thoroughness that shocked even the chroniclers of the time. The historian Rashid al-Din, writing half a century later, described books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran black with ink. Whether this is literally true or a literary exaggeration hardly matters. The library was gone, and with it a substantial portion of the accumulated knowledge of 5 centuries of Islamic civilization. Some of what was in the House of Wisdom had already been copied and distributed across the Islamic world. Some of what was at Alamut had been incorporated into al-Tusi's work at Maragheh. Knowledge is more resilient than the objects that contain it when it has been allowed to spread. But knowledge that existed only in single copies, in texts that had not been duplicated, in ideas that lived only in the manuscript collections of targeted communities, that knowledge died. How much died? We cannot calculate the loss, because we do not know what was there. We know what we have. We do not know what we are missing. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the destruction of libraries. When a building burns, you can measure the ruins. When a manuscript burns, the absence it leaves is invisible. You cannot point to a gap in the historical record and say with certainty, this is where the knowledge was. The gaps are silent. They do not announce themselves. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is that the destruction of the Alamut Library and the House of Wisdom in the 1250s represents a turning point in the intellectual history of the Islamic world. The century that preceded the Mongol conquests had been a period of extraordinary scientific and philosophical productivity. The era of Ibn Rushd, of Ibn al-Haytham, of al-Biruni, of the great mathematical and astronomical advances that had made the Islamic world the most scientifically sophisticated civilization on Earth. The century that followed was different. The institutional infrastructure that had supported that productivity, the libraries, the patronage networks, the academic communities, had been shattered. The recovery was real but incomplete. Scholars regrouped. New libraries were built. The Maragheh Observatory produced significant work, but the continuity had been broken, and some of what had been accumulated before the break was simply gone. And the Nizari intellectual tradition, specifically, was almost entirely lost. We have fragments. We have works that survived in copies made before the conquest, or that were preserved in communities outside the reach of the Mongols. The intellectual tradition did not die entirely. Ismaili scholarship continued in Yemen, in India, in communities scattered across the Islamic world. The Aga Khan's institutes today support research into Ismaili intellectual history, and scholars working in archives from London to Bombay are slowly recovering texts that were thought lost. But the core of what Alamut had accumulated over nearly 2 centuries, the works produced within the Nizari community itself, the records of their own history written in their own voice, the philosophical and theological texts that represented their understanding of their own faith, is gone. We have what their enemies said about them. We have what they managed to publish or distribute before the end. And we have the handful of things that al-Tusi and Juwayni decided were worth saving. It is not nothing, but it is a fraction of what was there. There is a particular cruelty in the way the Nizari library was destroyed that goes beyond the physical burning of books. The Nizari Ismaili community had spent nearly 2 centuries being systematically misrepresented by their enemies. They had been called hashish eaters, brainwashed fanatics, mindless killers, slanders that served the political interests of those who needed to discredit them. The library was, among other things, the accumulated evidence against those slanders. It contained their own account of who they were, what they believed, why they made the choices they made. When the library burned, that evidence burned with it. The slanders survived. The counter-arguments did not. For the next 8 centuries, the story of the Nizaris was told almost entirely by their enemies. because their enemies' books survived and theirs did not. This is what deliberate destruction of knowledge does. It does not just erase ideas, it shapes what future generations can know. It determines whose voice is heard and whose is silenced. It decides which version of history becomes the record and which becomes the rumor. The people who burned the library at Alamut understood this. That is why they burned it. The mountains of the Alborz still rise above the valley where Alamut once stood. The ruins of the fortress are still visible. A platform of rock and broken wall, exposed to the weather, slowly returning to the mountain that was always there. Scholars still climb it. Archaeologists have been working the site carefully for decades. They find things: fragments of ceramic, traces of plaster, the outlines of rooms that once held people and books and instruments for measuring the stars. They have not found the library. Libraries do not leave ruins, they leave absences. What we know about the Nizari intellectual tradition today comes from fragments, from works that survived outside Alamut, from references in hostile sources, from the slow recovery of manuscripts in unexpected archives. It comes from the dedicated work of scholars like Farhad Daftari, whose decades of research have done more than any other single effort to reconstruct what the Nizaris actually thought and wrote and believed. It comes from the Ismaili communities themselves, who maintained their traditions through centuries of persecution and dispersal. And it comes, in a strange and uncomfortable way, from al-Tusi, the man who collaborated with the destroyers, who carried some of the library's knowledge to Maragheh and incorporated it into his own work, who left us more than we would otherwise have, even if far less than we should. The Aga Khan Development Network has in recent years funded efforts to locate, digitize, and publish Ismaili manuscripts wherever they survive. The Institute of Ismaili Studies in London has assembled one of the most significant collections of Ismaili texts in the world. The work of recovery is ongoing, painstaking, and incomplete. Some of what burned can never be recovered, but some of what was scattered can still be found. There is a question that sits underneath this entire story, and it is not really a historical question. It is a question about what knowledge is for, and what we owe to it. Every generation inherits an incomplete archive. Every generation receives a record shaped by destruction, by accident, by the decisions of people who chose what was worth keeping and what was not. We read Aristotle because his texts survived and others did not. We know Roman history from the perspective of Romans, largely because Roman texts survived, and the texts of those they conquered often did not. We know the Nizaris almost entirely from their enemies because their enemies survived and they did not. The library at Alamut burned in 1256. The ideas inside it, some of them, had already escaped, carried in al-Tusi's memory and manuscripts, scattered in communities across the Islamic world, preserved in fragments that scholars are still finding. But most of it is gone, and the silence it left has been filled, for 8 centuries, by the stories of people who needed the Nizaris to be monsters. The fortress fell. The books burned, and the people who lit the fire knew exactly what they were doing. They were not just destroying a building, they were deciding what would be remembered, and for most of the 8 centuries since, they succeeded.